Hello, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get started. It looks like we still have some more people jumping on the call here. Welcome and thank you for being here for Friends of the Dunes' very first webinar series. And I'm going to invite my co-host Daisy to join me here as well. My name is Susie, and I'm the Programs and Operations Director with Friends of the Dunes. My pronouns are she, her.
Hello, my name is Daisy Embreeze, and I'm the Outreach Coordinator. My pronouns are she, her.
I would like to start by acknowledging that the environments that Friends of the Dunes is working to conserve are located in the unceded territory of the Wiyot people, which includes the Wiyot tribe, Bear River Rancheria, and Blue Lake Rancheria. Wiyot people continue to be stewards of the coastal environment surrounding the Humboldt Bay, or Wiki, as they have been since time immemorial, including the diverse coastal dunes, Wadal, located between Wiki and Shoor, the Pacific Ocean. One of the ways in which we can honor our placement within Wiyot territory is by recognizing the names of these places that we call home, as well as the native plants and animals of these places. Names that have existed long before the violent colonization of this area and attempted erasure of indigenous cultures and knowledge. I have up on your screen now some of the Wiyot names for some of our major bodies of water, as well as Eureka and Arcata. I am tuning in from Jarojiji, also known as Eureka. I encourage you to type into the chat where you are tuning in from. And just a reminder that within the chat, you can toggle between talking to just the panelists, which include myself, Daisy, and our presenter, as well as panelists and all attendees. So I encourage you to chat with all of the attendees and let us know where you're tuning in from, whether that is the indigenous lands you're tuning in from or the city, the name of the city. All right, and so I also thought for each presentation, I would introduce at least one new Wiyot word of the day. The word for today is Sutskish, and I hope that you're all bearing with me in my Wiyot pronunciations I am learning. And that word Sutskish means birds, which is perfect for our presentation today. Before we get started, I also just wanted to do a quick overview of Friends of the Dunes. Hopefully most of you are already familiar with our organization, but in case you are not, Friends of the Dunes is a nonprofit organization dedicated to conserving the natural diversity of coastal environments through community-supported education and stewardship programs. The important part of that, well, all of it's important, but the part that always stands out to me is the community-supported aspect. And I know a lot of our members are tuning in today, and our members are a huge part of the reason why we can do the work we do, as well as our volunteers. There's lots of ways to get involved with Friends of the Dunes, and if you are not already a member, I encourage you to become one. And the name of this series, Naturalist Notes, is actually inspired by our member newsletter, the Dunesberry, which has a feature known as Naturalist Notes. So that Dunesberry goes out to all of our members twice a year, and you can get it either electronically or a paper copy of that. All right, so we have a pretty good lineup, as I'm sure you're aware, because you're all tuning in right now. I wanted to go over some quick housekeeping notes before we get started. And please, if you haven't registered for the full webinar, if you're just tuning in for this one, consider other topics that you might be interested in joining us for. So a couple of quick housekeeping items. Please feel free to continue communicating amongst yourself in the chat throughout the presentation. If that chat box is popping up onto your screen, and bothering you as it's covering the screen, you can actually double click on it to open it, and then you can drag it right off of your screen. That way it won't be in your way. If you have questions for the presenter, please use the Q&A rather than using the chat box. It's going to be hard for us to find those questions within the chat box. So please type your questions into the Q&A, and Daisy and I will be asking Mark those questions at the end of the presentation. You can also control your view of the presentation. Right now, what I imagine or hope you're seeing is you can see my slides, and then you can see video of Daisy and myself on the side of your screen. You can actually control that. There's a bar that separates the two, and you can drag that bar in either direction to make one of those bigger. There's also an option to hide the video feed and just look at the slides. I believe that's in the top right corner. And last but not least, these webinars are being recorded, and we will be sending the link as well as the password to access the video to everybody that's registered for this webinar series. So if you really like this one and you want to share with friends, we encourage that. People can still sign up for the full series, and we will send them the videos after the fact so they can access those. Okay, and without further ado, I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I am going to introduce Dr. Martin Caldwell, who is an ornithologist and HSU professor in the wildlife department. Welcome, Mark, and thanks for being here. I actually did want, I'm surprising you with a quick icebreaker question.
Whoa.
So, hope you're ready for this.
Okay.
I was wondering, if you were any type of bird, what type of bird would you be?
I almost thought you were going to ask something like this. It's sort of akin to what's your favorite bird? And I have an answer to that. Well, my favorite individual is the bird I'm going to talk about today, orange, red, yellow, red. But my favorite species happens to be a species of sandpiper known as a phalarope, Wilson's phalarope, that I studied for 6 years when I was in grad school. And, you know, I could talk at length about Wilson's phalaropes, but today I'm going to talk about orange, red, yellow, red. So I'm not sure. I certainly would want to live a long life, which is what orange, red, yellow, red has succeeded in doing, right?
Definitely. Thank you. All right. So yeah, so let's just get on into it and hear some more about this somewhat famous plover. I've been hearing a lot about him in the plover outreach community. He's pretty famous for being the oldest known plover on record, as is the title of your talk. So I will share my screen. I'm going to be sharing Mark's slides, so he's going to be telling me when to transition, and we'll jump into it. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Well, it's delightful to be here this evening. I recognize a fair number of names in the list of participants, including some students from quite a few years back, as well as some that graduated just a year or so ago. So I also see that there are people from the local community, and hopefully I can broaden your understanding of not just this one special plover who has a place in my heart, but you're looking at a piece of artwork that Ram Popish up in Oregon did for a recent book that I edited on the plovers of the world. And I guess one of the things we should deal with first is, how do you pronounce that plover? Are you a plover lover? Are you a plover lover? Or what? You know, this is a confusing thing for many people. Anyway, I'm going to talk about one of the birds on this screen that's off to the left there, the very left, the snowy plover. So if you could advance the screen, Susie, we'll go to the next slide. And just as an overview of the species, what you're looking at is a range map for the breeding and winter distribution and migratory routes of the subspecies of plover that exist in North America, this species, Snowy Plover. And this is important in part because the Pacific Coast population is the one that is listed under the Endangered Species Act. And so birds that are breeding on the coast here in Humboldt County, as far north as Washington, and then south along California coast to Southern California and even onto Baja, are all part of that listed population segment. And those birds are resident year round locally. Then if you cross the Sierras and the Cascades into the Great Basin, you'll see there's some birds also breeding there at places like Mono Lake and Great Salt Lake and Honey Lake. And those birds are migratory. And there's also a Great Plains population that's shown in the Playa Lakes region of Texas and Oklahoma, for instance. Next slide. So here's a little bit more detail on the listed population. That is, the Pacific Coast population under the Endangered Species Act is listed as threatened, owing to a reduction in the number of breeding locations over the last 4 or so decades, and also a reduction in the number of breeding birds within the range that's shown in pink on the left-hand diagram. On the right happens to be the same breeding distribution for the listed population, showing in circles of varying population size the numbers of birds that breed. And you can see that most of the individual plovers along the Pacific coast reside year-round, for the most part, in Southern California, which puts them in conflict with lots of things that people do and lots of people. And about halfway up the coast, you can easily see where we are, just south of the Oregon border, with a small little blip of multiple dots on the screen representing the Humboldt County birds. There are also birds in Mendocino and birds up at Tolowa Dunes that are breeding right now. Next slide. All right, so let's get to the exciting part of this story for me. You know, when you're a biologist and you're seeking to do research, one of the adages, or one of the things that people tell you, is never study a species whose longevity exceeds your ability to garner resources to study them for however many years. Well, I lost that competition with this bird, the oldest snowy plover on record. You're looking at a photo from one of my former grad students, Luke Everhart Phillips. And this photo came from, I believe, Clam Beach, when this bird still resided there. But orange red, yellow red is exceptional among snowy plovers in that it shatters the record for longevity in this species. And the nearest old bird along the Pacific coast is one from Oregon that lived 15 years. Well, this bird is approaching its 20th birthday, and it was seen just this last week up on Big Lagoon, where it's been breeding for the last few years. I'll give you more details there. Next slide. Susie, next slide. Thank you. All right, so orange, red, yellow, red, right? That's the name of this bird. And if you look back at that slide, the previous slide, I was going to tell you that the way you read the color band is the left leg first, the orange band above the red, and then the right leg, yellow band above the red band below. And this is by convention, and it's a name given to this bird, a unique combination of colors that allow us to recognize this bird for as long as it lives, right? We've had to replace the color bands on this bird a few times because he's just worn them out. But underneath one of the bands, he has a metal U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service band that has numbers on it that are the unique identifiers for this particular individual. So the history of this bird begins about 20 years ago when Amber Transu and Sean McAllister were working with me early on in my 20-year history with the bird. And we banded this bird, this male, as a chick at that location where the red arrow is, just below Table Bluff on the ocean fronting beach there. So if Susie taps on the screen or gets us going, you'll see that red arrow move up to Clam Beach, where a year later, this individual bred and continued to breed there for another 8 years, pretty much. Then tap on the screen again and move that arrow, and the bird subsequently has moved up to Stone Lagoon, and tap again. It has shifted between Stone and Big Lagoon in recent history. So it's almost like the 20 years have a first half where it bred on Clam Beach, and then a second half where it bred on the lagoons, the big berms that are up there. So that's the history of where it hatched, and the next slide or bullet's going to just simply give you that its information is this is a year-round resident individual. It doesn't migrate. It winters on, used to winter on Clam Beach. It now winters at Big Lagoon. And next, the breeding locations are those that I just told you about. So it's rather localized in its movements. And that localized movement, as in it's a resident bird year-round, contrasts with other individuals in the population which breed here and winter elsewhere, or winter here and breed elsewhere. I mean, there are combinations here of what birds do along the Pacific coast. And this bird is quite sedentary, if you will, in its movements. Next slide. All right, so as a conservationist and one interested in the population of this bird, and specifically growing the population so that it is removed from the endangered species list, there are two facets of the biology or the demography of the species that are important. And this is one of them, lifespan, right? And so along the x-axis, you're seeing years. And then on the y-axis, in black and gray combined, are the male and female, respectively, total numbers of individuals that lived 1 year as an adult, or 2 years, 3 years, 4, 5, 6. And so the star out to the right is orange, red, yellow, red, who's about to hit his 20th birthday. If he makes it to the 26th of June, I understand that there's a local group that's going to have a party of some sort somewhere to celebrate this bird's 20th birthday. So this longevity is for adult birds. There actually are, what's lopped off here are the chicks that hatch or the juveniles that fledge, but that don't even make it to 1 year old, right? So this, there are a couple of other birds that have lived quite a long time, 12 years and 10-year-old males, for instance. But most of the birds live just about 3 years. If it's a male and a female, the average adult longevity is 3 years. So this male, orange, red, yellow, red, is exceptional. Okay, so population biology involves living a long time, but you gotta breed. So the next slide illustrates, oh, sorry, before I get to the breeding, here's the dog ears analogy, right? Orange, red, yellow, red. You can read the color bands there again. I just mentioned 3 years is the arrow indicating the average longevity of adult plovers. And you've heard these arguments about small, medium, large sized dogs. I don't know what this does for a bird of this size, but it's off the charts old. I mean, it's pushing 100-something years old on the human scale, if we're going to go there, because it's a small shorebird. It's not very big. And there are other questions about why, if this bird is that old, is it showing any signs of senility, for instance? I'm not sure, but it might be. It's possible. Next slide. Okay, so I mentioned longevity. Here's reproductive success. So along the x-axis are individuals that have produced fledged young, 0, they're in increments of 5, 1, but you see 0, 5, 10, 15, 20. So the frequency histograms here show that the vast majority of plovers in our population have a big fat goose egg in terms of the number of young that they produce in their lifetimes, right? And it's just a small percentage of birds, just a little over 10% of the males and a little over 10% of the females, that produce 50% of the offspring that contribute to future generations. And I don't have the star representing orange, red, yellow, red, but believe it or not, that's not him at 20. He, in this diagram, is back toward 12, 10. But if I updated this, he would be at 22, I believe, after this last summer fledged young. That is really, really stupendous. He's, that's fitness in a Darwinian sense, right? Next slide. All right, so let me talk a little bit about the population of plovers locally. This photo is actually a little misleading in that there are only 2 eggs there in the nest. And believe it or not, that little shallow depression scraped in the sand is often all that the bird does to create a nest. There are typically 3 eggs. And the view that you have here is on one of the spits at the Eel River mouth from years ago. And that is typical habitat in which the plovers breed. They choose these open, sparsely vegetated habitats and lay their clutches of 3 eggs, the female does, in a shallow depression, and then shares the incubation with the male. Females incubate during the day, males at night, and they rely not on any vegetation, obviously, to hide the nest. They involve on their early detection of danger posed by predators of eggs and themselves, and detecting those approaching ravens or skunks or whatever it may be, and getting off the nest and scurrying away so that the predator can't find the eggs. Or they actually do that feigning of injury that you see killdeer do, a close relative. All right, next slide. Here's a busy figure of Humboldt County, where we've been studying them for 20 years, plovers. And it's just to make the point, with the black dots arrayed along the coastal ocean fronting beaches. And so all the way down to McNutt Gulch, you see a single black dot, and then Centerville Beach, and then going north all the way to Clam Beach. And then the inset on the right of this figure is to extend the study area all the way north to the lagoons and Gold Bluff Beach. And so the point is that the birds breed on those ocean fronting beaches, and I'll come back to this, but it puts them in danger because people recreate in those same habitats, and managing people is an important part of conservation. So you're looking again at the 20-year history of where plovers have bred, and it's simply a presence-absence phenomenon that you see here, with the black dots representing at least 1 plover nest and the open circles representing stretches of beach where there were no nests in the 20-year history. Interestingly, the longer you study something, the more patterns obtain or develop, and there are nests this year just north of the North Spit on the Humboldt Bay Jetty, near the Humboldt Bay North Spit Jetty. And that's not something that has been seen ever locally. So these birds move around in their breeding, and they often aggregate in particular stretches of beach. They like to be one with another, right? Next slide. All right, and the first slide, or the slide 2 back, illustrated this wide, sparsely vegetated habitats, right? It's the same figure you see here with the distribution of where plovers are breeding. And they like to breed on ocean fronting beaches. They used to breed on the gravel bars of the lower Eel River. If you're driving across that Fern Bridge access towards Ferndale, up and downstream from Fern Bridge, used to have breeding plovers, but they like wide beaches, twice as wide as the unoccupied sites. So every spot that has a black circle is twice as wide on average as the open circles that you see here. And there's a statistically significant relationship there. The birds like to have unvegetated habitats where they can view surrounding areas day and night and get off that nest again to evade predators and hide from them. And these habitats occur especially at the mouth of the Eel River and the mouth of the Mad River also, and then in restoration areas that folks associated with the National Park Service, the state parks, BLM, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are engaged in restoring dune habitats. Well, this is the forte of Friends of the Dunes also, right? All right, so that answers the question of where plovers breed. Next slide. And in terms of reproduction, which is essential to recovering the species, it's listed. This slide illustrates or shows 3 newly hatched plovers in a typical sparsely vegetated habitat, but it's amidst some oyster shells. This is on the south spit of Humboldt Bay, where the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, has created a special area to manage plovers. And part of that involves clearing vegetation, but also scattering oyster shells so that the eggs and the chicks and the incubating adults are less seen. They're more camouflaged in those habitats than on just a bare sandy substrate. So I'll give you more details on the factors that influence variation in individuals like orange red, yellow red's production of young in the next slide, right? We know where they breed and where do they produce most young. Here's the same image, the study area extending all along the coastal beaches and up the Eel River. And the data here happen to be categorized into open circles that are white, right? Where the average plover breeding, where they do breed, right? I'm not including the unoccupied cells or stretches of beach that were in the previous slide like this. It's only those slides or those areas where the plovers breed, where you can determine how well they produce young. And there are a bunch of places where the average number of young produced is 0. And then there are some others that are shaded light gray that are 0 to 1 young on average per year. And then the black filled circles happen to be those sites at which birds are most successful at producing chicks on average. And I'll come back to this, but the south spit of Humboldt Bay, which is that slide a few back with the chicks in the nest, happens to be producing lots of young plovers. So we did a series of statistical analyses because we collect data on people and ravens as the principal factors that limit reproductive success or even drive it for 0, or the absence of people and ravens means there are more plover chicks, right? So the results of that study, the statistical analysis, would be that there's a correlation that where plovers produce more young, there are fewer people on average and fewer ravens. We also collected data over the years on the abundance of some of their favorite food items. If you walk the beaches and you kick any of that debris that is brown algae, I'm not talking about big bull kelp, Nereocystis, but the little smaller fucus and Negresia, the small pieces of kelp or brown algae off the beach, you'll kick them over and there'll be teeming masses, depending on how big the chunk of brown algae is, but teeming masses of little amphipods bouncing around. And where that food is more abundant, the plovers produce more young. That's a subtle effect. And I'll come back to it. Next slide. Okay, so I've been a little bit through the ecology of what drives this population. In the few remaining slides, I want to talk about the management and conservation of the things that affect plover reproductive success. And so given that people have a negative effect on plover reproductive success, what is it that we can do to improve that relationship such that plovers do better where there are lots of people? You're looking at a sign on a fence post that we used to put up on Clam Beach, and people refer to this as symbolic fencing, and it's meant to seek the cooperation of the public in not entering an area where plovers are breeding. And so if you look behind the fence and underneath the manage quotes, you'll see a square cage that's erected on the beach. I'll come back to that, but that is specifically meant to keep ravens and other predators from getting the eggs, which are inside that cage. So we can educate people to varying degrees. That's successful or not. I suppose this sort of talk, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, in that those who are attending are sensitive to the conservation issues I'm talking about. Reaching out and getting the message out to others might be more challenging who have different views. If education isn't successful, you can go further in restricting access. The symbolic fence here does that to some extent, but there's not a whole lot of teeth to this. And so in the event that folks don't cooperate, there are some places along the Pacific coast where folks are cited for violations of entering closed areas that are specifically for plovers. And obviously, you know, that's the last thing you want to do, because you don't earn any points with folks who are opposed to plover conservation by doing that. You probably just make matters worse. So that's part of the story about how to manage people. There are other more challenging things, perhaps. So next slide. And so I mentioned that ravens in particular are good at finding nests. And you're looking at an egg that has spilled its contents of yolk in particular. That orange is this is an egg that just was laid by a female on Clam Beach, and a raven didn't get it, but a crow, an American crow, got it. I watched the bird walk up to the nest and, you know, grab the egg and spill the contents, and it had a hard time eating that smoothie. Anyway, ravens locally are, as I showed in that, or I mentioned in the statistical analysis, are a negative effect on reproductive success. And so this brings up questions about how to manage ravens, both lethally and non-lethally. And I'm sure everybody agrees that the initial attempts to manage ravens should be non-lethal approaches, including the use of exclosures. And so there's that cage. It is called an exclosure because it excludes predators from entering the cage. And in the middle of the cage on the bottom happens to be the nest with 3 eggs. And the plovers quickly figure out that they can go to the nest, sit on the eggs and incubate and not be disturbed by, well, they do get off the nest and they run out of the exclosure, but there's a cage, there's a top on it too. That's that bird netting you might put over your garden crops. So we've tried this and it works to some extent in hatching chicks, but there are anecdotes that I have, one of which is I watched newly hatched chicks leave an exclosure and get eaten by a raven that was very well aware of what was in the exclosure the day before and was just waiting for dinner or breakfast actually, to exit the exclosure. So you only solve half the problem here, that of getting eggs to hatch. The young are precocial, meaning they'll hatch and within a few hours leave the nest and leave this exclosure. And then those chicks become vulnerable to the same predators and humans, right? In terms of trampling or things like that. We've also tried to explore the use of effigies and scare tactics. I'm not going to go into a great length about this, but we did an experiment in the winter on Clam Beach. And while we could reduce the likelihood that ravens would occur in the vicinity of a raven that was a road-killed raven that we hung from a stick, there's more to this experiment, but we could decrease the number of ravens visiting that area around the effigy of the raven that we had hung. The effect was only a matter of a few meters, and you would have had to put up hundreds. It would have been a spooky place to go for a walk if you're interested in, serene, beautiful landscape. All those dead ravens hanging, if we had used scare tactics on Clam Beach, would have been crazy. So habitat restoration, I mentioned, is attractive in that it creates habitats that provide raven or plovers with the opportunity to nest in the open such that they can escape the approach of predators like ravens at a great distance. And there is some evidence from one of my former grad students, Katie Raby, that the survival of nests in areas where habitat restoration has taken place is improved. We do not practice lethal methods locally, but that would be the sort of the last case scenario if other things didn't work. And it does work. It may not be a palatable method for ethical reasons for many people, but there is evidence to suggest that localized shooting, trapping, and poisoning can reduce the populations of ravens, especially individuals that are known to prey on eggs and therefore increase reproductive success. Next slide. I'm almost done. Here's a view of South Spit. And you're looking at, I've got it highlighted here. This image is a few years old, but the restoration area that BLM manages by bulldozing the dune grass, that Ammophila that was introduced, it's European beach grass, right? That is a non-native species that compromises the open habitats that plovers like. It grows in densely and plovers don't like to nest in that area. So this restoration area on South Spit is specifically for plovers. And in 2016, I believe, after many years of this location being managed for plovers, but no plovers showing up, all of a sudden in 2016, they figured it out. And for the 4 or 5 subsequent years leading up to last year, generally, the number of plovers increased in that area up to 40 something, and the reproductive success was quite high until last year when ravens figured out that there was something to be had out there. So restoration works, but to have a really positive effect, it might require additional habitat management or predator management in that case. Next slide. I think the one challenging thing that I mentioned in the early analysis was that plovers tended to produce more young in association with the food that you see here balled up on the beach. These are teletrid amphipods that feed on kelp. Now that is a rack line of kelp down towards Petrolia and the Mattole River mouth. It's on the McNutt Gulch Beach. That is a lot of Nereocystis. And, that is what, if you have that healthy amount, that's more than healthy, but that sort of debris on the beach, the plovers are going to have an abundance of food. So the problem might be, how do you manipulate that? And I'm not sure that anybody is really approaching the relationship that we demonstrated between food and reproductive success by actually, say, moving around big clumps, not maybe this big, but you could enhance the food in an area for plovers, which might have a subtle effect on reproductive success, as in, young grow better. The adults, when they're incubating and females laying eggs, would have more food to invest in the energy required to incubate, tend young, lay eggs. That would be a challenging thing to do on a large spatial scale. Next slide. That's all I have. There's some fuzzy, cute little snowy plovers from the Eel River gravel bars where they no longer breed. And you'll see the tip of the bill has a little white spot on it, which indicates that these birds hatched within the last 24 hours. That's the egg tooth. And I mentioned that plovers used to breed on the gravel bars up and downstream from Fernbridge. They no longer do, to our knowledge. And when they were there breeding, they don't winter there, they're on the beaches. One of the most successful plovers on that reproductive success diagram that I showed back at the beginning happened to be a bird that bred on the gravel bars. And the rocks that you see here are often of different size and color, and the adults, the chicks, and the eggs all are quite cryptic in those habitats, which almost certainly leads to that higher reproductive success along the gravel bars. All right, that's all I have. If you have questions, I think Daisy and Susie are going to field those for me.
Yes, we are. Thank you, Mark, for all that great information. I'm just going to leave up these cute little few balls for a minute because those baby plovers, one thing that I always really appreciated about plovers is that when they are born, their legs are fully grown.
Yeah, we put bands, full-size adult bands on the chicks when they hatch. That's how we get the longevity data. That's how we know where orange, red, yellow, red originated. We banded that male when he was this age, just below Table Bluff.
That is so cute.
Yeah, they are cute.
So that is, Mark, don't mark me down in points right now on this quiz. But there's when young hatch and they right away can get up and run around. That's called,
That's precocial and nidifugus. They leave the nest. Nidi is Latin for nest. Nidifugus means they leave the nest immediately, and or within hours. And they have legs that are gargantuan in size compared to their little fluffy bodies. You can't really see the wings here. They're little nubs that eventually grow full flight feathers in about a month, right? But they're precocial and nidifugus. Songbirds, like robins, stay in the nest. They're altricial.
Those are the precocial and altricial. Those are the words I was trying to remember.
Yep.
Admittedly, it has been over a decade since I took your ornithology class. So.
That's all right. I always have to check things in the glossary of my texts.
Okay, well, I'm going to stop the share now, so it's a little easier for Daisy and I to navigate these questions here, but we do have some coming in, so I'll let Daisy take the lead on that.
Yeah, we have a bunch of questions. So first question from Natalia Soika. What are your current or future conservation projects for snowy plovers?
Natalia, that's a I just retired or half retired. I have stepped back after 20 years on plovers. So there's not much I'm doing locally other than advising people in some cases. I'm finishing up. We're still working on plovers, but it was a hard thing for me to do after 20 years to say, I am not going to study them anymore.
She says tears.
Yeah, it's sad.
Yeah.
We all have to move on at some point. It was time for somebody else to take on the task locally.
Yeah, and since we're on it, she asked another question. You once mentioned the possibility of teaching ravens to avoid snowy plover eggs by tricking them into consuming eggs that would make them sick. Is that a possibility for future management strategies here?
I had a grad student, Matt Brinkman, who used aversive conditioning And he did so in Southern California on the Camp Pendleton Marine Base, where plovers and least terns breed, and few ravens breed there. In fact, they're territorial. And so the condition where you could use aversive conditioning with poisoned eggs making ravens sick and to condition them to avoid plover eggs would be it would only work if you had territorial birds where you could condition individuals not to eat the eggs on their territory, and they would keep other ravens away. Well, if you spend any time on any beach in Humboldt County, that is not what typifies the raven population locally. There are hundreds of crows and ravens on Clam Beach alone. And if you were to go about any of those predator management strategies, the lethal ones, you would be, and so this is an argument against it, you would not be killing the offending individuals nor poisoning them in an aversive conditioning, because there are hundreds of them in that area, and none of them specialize on plover eggs, right? They happen to encounter them just as they're foraging around. But back to Southern California, my student Matt Brinkman showed on Camp Pendleton in a nice series of experiments that if you inject eggs with an aversive agent, carbachol, that you can condition the local raven on the territory associated with his study plots not to eat eggs. But the duration of the effect is short, right? They quickly figure out that, things aren't poisoned anymore. Ravens are way too smart. Way too smart.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. Okay. There's so many questions. Okay. So multiple questions are the same. So why aren't they reproducing on the eel gravel bars anymore?
Yeah, I don't, the story there, I don't want to just, weave a story, but when we started working on the gravel bars right around 2000, there were drought conditions, and the gravel bars are generally underwater in the winter, right? There's no wintering flock in that area. They're down at the mouth of the Eel River. But it requires that those habitats be exposed in March and April, May and June for the birds to be able to breed on them. Exposed being the water levels have come down and they stay down, right? And so the dry years, for whatever reason, some plovers figured it out that there are places to breed, and they did well. And when plovers breed well, that is hatch eggs and fledge chicks, they come back to the same spot. That's happening on South Spit. And that happened on the Eel River gravel bars for a good almost 10 years. And then we had high water years in the winter that trailed into the spring, meaning the plovers couldn't settle there. They had to go find someplace else to breed in the spring. And even some of the nests got washed away in June of one year. So, the habitat itself is such, and the population actually dropped locally to 19 individuals. It's now closer to 70 or so. But when it dropped to 19, 10 males, 9 females, well, a bunch of the birds that were on the gravel bars were the ones that died. And really there was just one or two, and they couldn't breed there. So they switched their breeding locations out to the mouth of the Eel River.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they're birds of high site fidelity.
If they're successful, yes, they come back to the same spot. That said, birds, this species moves around a lot. I mean, if I put in motion that black and white image, which is all 20 years combined, showing the black spots where they breed, the white circles where they don't. If I had every 1 year black and white, you would see a blinking set of black and white things going off on and off the screen. It would be very dynamic. And just back to South Spit, there's a run now of 5-6 years with the birds breeding there. And they bred there very well for 4 years, not last year. And so they're going to continue to breed there because they have history there, right?
Yeah.
Success.
Mhm.
and they will come back. But if they're young birds and they fail, they leave and they find other plovers and they nest near them, right? They use information from other plovers to gauge, where's a suitable place to nest, and they readily move. They don't defend a territory.
Mm.
So you can get nests as close as 20 meters away in some cases. I mean, that's not 20 meters. 20 meters is pretty close though. Go ahead, next question.
Okay, next question. What percentage of chicks are banded in a season, either in Humboldt County or in general?
We were lucky in Humboldt County over the years that I was working that I had very good people working with me, and I cracked the whip on folks so that we banded 95 to almost 100% of all chicks that hatched.
Oh.
And that allowed us in subsequent analyses to know that the local population was one third of those chicks that were marked locally bred locally. The other 2/3, 67%, came from Oregon or somewhere else on the Pacific coast to breed here. Do you follow me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we used to band almost every chick so that we could get this sort of information about what drives the population's increases or decreases or stability. And we know that for many years, immigration from Oregon, where they're much more aggressive at managing predators, lethally and non-lethally, and people, but that they exported one-year-old plovers and they bred here. 2/3, sorry, I'm repeating myself, but that's a lot of the local breeding population did not come from Humboldt County.
Yeah, that kind of leads in another question. How's the
Yep.
success of our local populations? How do they do compared to the Oregon populations? And is there different management strategies? So you kind of
Wow, that's a lot of information. Well, there are 6 recovery units as part of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service plan for the species. And north of us, Oregon and Washington are 1 recovery unit. Northern California, Del Norte, Humboldt, Mendocino are another recovery unit. And then they're further south, there's more. This population is well below the recovery objective of 150 breeding adults. We've never cracked 50% of that number. And if you go north to Oregon, they've exceeded the recovery objective for that location. And part of it is, again, they have aggressive locations at which they lethally and non-lethally manage predators. And that's also true in other places south of here, at Camp Pendleton, for instance, where my student Matt did the work on aversive conditioning. Well, he also lethally removed some predators of plover eggs, chicks, and adults. Did I miss some of the question there?
No, I think you got the
Okay.
question. Yeah.
I'm correct.
So let's see. Has the effect of climate change on breeding success been investigated?
No. That is a future. There have been future projections of what sea level rise is going to do to the coastal habitats that are favored by plovers. And it's specifically, under scenarios of this much or that much sea level rise, what habitats will remain. That is one step in the direction of understanding the effects on the population. I mean, the subtle effects on reproductive success, that would be hard to model in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. More on ravens. Okay, I heard that often ravens are attracted to beaches by picnicking humans. Do you know if there's any kind of data to support this? If this is the case, perhaps closing parts of the beaches seasonally as a solution.
Yeah, there is definitely an association between ravens, crows, and people. And, there are all sorts of anecdotes that I can give, but there is a correlation. The places in Humboldt County that have most ravens are places like Clam Beach and Mad River Beach, et cetera. And, that's right adjacent to lots of residential suburban areas and other ag fields. And there's roadkill along 101 and things like that are associated with people. But on the beaches themselves, those beaches where people go out and have a picnic happen to be the ones where ravens like to follow up the next, morning early after all that garbage is on the beach.
Mm-hmm.
And I once did, a couple of little study, sort of fun and games kind of stuff to test whether the ravens on Clam Beach behave differently than the ones at the mouth of the Eel River, where people will shoot at them. Personal experience, I've been down there and people shoot a lot of things down there illegally and otherwise. But when I walked directly toward ravens on Clam Beach, I could get within a few, like 5 to 10 meters of them. On the Eel River beaches, either side of the Eel River mouth, when I did the same direct approach, watch when does the bird fly away. It's called flight initiation distance, right? You just walk at your subject, and when they take off, you pace the different distance to where they took off to. It was closer to 80 to 100 meters. The birds, the ravens at the Eel River are way more wary of people than they are on Clam Beach. So closing beaches, there aren't too many places. You better put Camp Pendleton in mind if you're going to do something like that. Or you're on the Coal Oil Point Reserve of the UC Santa Barbara system, where it's the university's private land, and they can fence off beaches and ticket people and educate people very well. But I don't see that happening in Humboldt County. The closest that they get to that is South Spit with BLM's management, but it requires enforcement. You have to ticket people. There's got to be teeth to that sort of restriction, prohibition.
Yeah, more enforcement. Okay. So Angela Patrice, yeah.
Hi, Angela.
Just to clarify, was the dip in breeding success you observed last year on South Spit due to raven predation?
Pretty much, yeah. And I probably shouldn't spill the beans on this. There's still birds down there this year, not as many as last year. Yeah. Hi, Angela.
Okay, another one from Angela. I hope you're well. In addition to the removal of European beach grass and the addition of mussel shells on beaches to enhance crypsis, are there other restoration efforts which can improve snowy plover survival on Humboldt County beaches?
Those are the two things that really come to mind that state parks and BLM and are doing. They're places where restoring native dunes, and this is Friends of the Dunes, forte, but involves restoring the complete ecosystem, right? So I think state parks at the Crannell Road, however you want to pronounce it, that area of dunes that was bulldozed now 15 years ago and subsequently has been maintained as open shifting dunes, is meant to not just be for plovers. It's for the bees and flowers and native flora and fauna. There are specific locations, however, where, and I've mentioned them already, where BLM is taking a less ecosystem approach and more, it's BLM on South Spit, the stretch of beach that the plovers are occupying, again, is specifically a plover management area. I mean, they're scattering so much oyster shell that if you walk through there in your bare feet, you could, you'd be going to the emergency room. Yeah. I'm not saying it's bad. I mean, it hides eggs and chicks and adults incubating very well.
Mhm. Mhm.
I put restoration in with, or predator management in with restoration. It's sort of dealt with differently, but I think, it has to be that if you're managing a habitat for plovers specifically, and you're doing what BLM is doing,
Mhm.
To really be successful, if you're going all in for plovers, you've got to have a game plan that manages the ravens that now have figured out something on South Spit. And, unfortunately, it was going well for a while, and the whole recovery unit, all the average reproductive success of all the plovers in Del Norte, Humboldt, Mendocino County was driven by what positive things were going on South Spit in that area by a large number of the of birds. And there are a lot of birds there still, but they're not going to do well. And they didn't do that well last year. So they've got to figure out, how to deal with those ravens. It's part of restoration, I think.
Yeah, ravens are a big problem. We have many questions on ravens.
Oh yeah, they always
another one.
generate.
Yeah. Did the ravens figure out the South Spit population because of people recreating more on with the pandemic?
I don't really know that I can answer that.
pandemic
There
maybe
isn't
related?
much habitat out there for them to breed in. There's only that one cypress tree at the very inside tip opposite king salmon. And so the birds that come out there, you can see family groups of ravens on the beaches, in the summer. But there are likely birds that don't obtain a breeding territory and wander. And that's another issue. There are a lot of ravens and a lot of what biologists call floaters in the population that are capable of breeding. Their ages, they're 2, 3, 4 years old, but they can't find a breeding spot, and because there's no territory available to them. And so they just wander. And if they figure out that there's food on South Spit, then they're going to stay around. And all it takes is, they are opportunistic. You could do a lot to manage ravens in terms of what people leave on the beach garbage wise. But think about a dead pinniped washing up on the beach. What are you going to do with that? Yeah, as an attractant and a long-term food source? I don't have the answer.
Yeah. Okay, what is the total population of snowy plovers in Humboldt County? And also, I'm going to turn on my light because I realize I'm getting dark.
You're getting very dark. I don't know exactly. It's probably around 50 to 60 right now. There are a few birds that are breeding right now down by Fort Bragg in state parks lands at 10 Mile Beach and things like that. And then there are some birds up right now at the just south of the Smith River mouth that are looking like they're going to breed, but there haven't been nests. And so north and south of here, most of the birds are in Humboldt County breeding. 50 probably right now.
Yeah, that's nowhere near the 150 that we need. So out of curiosity, how big are your exclosures? And they look a lot bigger than the ones in SoCal.
Yes, that's an old photo that I showed you. And the ones that are currently in use up and down the Pacific coast, we have not used exclosures here for 10 plus years with a few exceptions, but they're much smaller now and easier to put in place. So whoever asked that question, good eyes. Those are gargantuan and they take forever to put up and take down. Yeah, if you can walk in with a little exclosure, that's much better. And that's the design that most people use. We don't use exclosures anymore. Orange, red, yellow, red. Early on, we put over 100 exclosures up around nests on Clam Beach, especially in about the first 10 years of his life, 8 years. He was in 10 different exclosures and he hatched chicks on Clam Beach. He was one of the few birds that did. And he stayed there to breed because we duped him into thinking it was an okay place. And we stopped using exclosures, long story, and I won't tell it. And he failed a couple of times. He failed, and then he moved north to Stone Lagoon and Big Lagoon. And he's done 10 times better at those locations than on Clam Beach. In fact, our management was, you could argue, backfired because we kept him in a location that was, rife with problems, ravens, people, etc. And he didn't reproduce much. He had a few chicks that fledged in the first 8 years of his life. Most of his reproductive success, Stone Lagoon, Big Lagoon.
Okay. And that's where he currently is, right?
Shh. Yes, somewhere to our north.
somewhere
I'm
on
being
the coast.
vague.
Sorry.
That's okay. I mean, if you go to Big Lagoon and you walk that beach, you're going to see the fencing of rope and signage that's going to tell you there's a plover nest here. Don't go in here. So anybody looking for plovers, especially in that location, is going to be able, if you have binoculars, just stay outside the fence a ways, and you're fine as long as you abide by the rules. But he's somewhere up there.
There's a good question from Sandra there, Daisy, that's related to what Mark was just saying. It was typed in by Emily. Sorry, I can just read it. So Sandra Jerebeck asked, why did orange, red, yellow, red move so how does that relate to breeding success?
Well, I mean, most birds do not live that long, right? And so over the 20 years, he really had two parts of his life. The first 8 or so years on Clam Beach breeding, and then all of a sudden, after we stopped using exclosures out there, he moved. And I remember, he was old enough at that time that somebody commented to me, one of my students says, like, I haven't seen orange, red, yellow, red for a while. And I thought, well, he's either dead or he figured something out here. And about a month later, there he was on Stone Lagoon with a group of 3 chicks. And, but I think as typically these birds don't live but 1 or 2 years, and they make a decision about where to breed next year or next time based on how well they did last time, right? And so for the most part, last time is just last year, because you don't live, the average plover lives 3 years, right? Breeds 3 years, right? This guy had multiple opportunities to evaluate the setting, right? And it was after a prolonged period of failures where he finally ditched it and went to Stone and Big Lagoon. And that's where he winters too. He used to winter and breed on Clam Beach. He now winters and breeds on the lagoons somewhere.
Somewhere. Natalia had a question about orange, red, yellow, red. Do you think the old man has a biological advantage?
You froze up. I missed the last part. Does the old man, she's not talking about me, I don't think. Nope.
I can finish up. I think Daisy got a little frozen there.
Yeah.
Does the old man, I believe she's referring to orange, red, yellow, red,
yes, I understand,
have a biological advantage that is simply unknown, which has contributed to his survival, or is he just a very lucky bird?
I don't know how to answer that. One thing that you could do that these data are rich, is that we know who his offspring are because we've banded every one of his chicks. So if there is a genetic component to this, I'm not saying we're going to analyze what gene is there for high reproductive success, but if it's a heritable trait, then it ought to be present in his offspring to some extent, that they ought to be good at reproducing. I don't know how you can separate that from good or bad luck, however you want to look at luck, right? I mean, he has survived a long time. I imagine there's just dumb luck in some of that. But the genetics of it are really a much more complex aspect of the subtleties of the things that he does, and it could be learned behavior, right? I mean, we have, oh boy, get me going on some of the birds that have lived long enough where I'm shooting myself because we didn't take advantage of taking behavioral data on whether, as a 1-year-old, the way that they incubated or tended chicks differed from when they were 2, 3, 4, 5, or 20 years old. Does he behave differently now than when he was a dumb teenager breeding on Clam Beach, right? I don't know. And I'll say it again, stupid me never kicked in on having the behavioral sampling regime to gauge simple things like, does a male or a female sitting on eggs or chicks, how do they react to the approach of a predator? Do they stay on the eggs? And some of the birds, when you approach the nest to go to band or look at the nest to check its status, they start going crazy within a meter or two of you. And other birds, when you walk down the beach 100 meters off, you know where the nest is, and you see the female in the daytime leave the nest. And she always does that. And she's an old, we had older females that did that. And I always thought, well, did they learn that behavior? Mm-hmm. And I don't have an answer to that, but it's not the genetics. I'm talking, well, maybe genetics is part of learning too, right? But I can't answer the question. I mean, I think he's just damn lucky. Yeah. Especially given the number of peregrine falcons that are around breeding. I mean, the new eyrie for falcons is right at Little River Rock. He doesn't breed there anymore, but Clam Beach, right there is, that used to be where plovers wintered, and they don't very much anymore, right in that Cornell Road restoration area. Mm-hmm. And there are peregrines breeding on the rock, on the headland between Stone and Big Lagoon. I don't know. Maybe those peregrines don't go after the plovers, but I'd be surprised if they don't pick them off occasionally. Mm-hmm. He's lucky.
He's just lucky. Yeah. I had some other questions, but they disappeared on me.
Oh, sorry, I was managing a couple of the questions there, Daisy.
Oh,
so I understand if people jump off the call, but we're going to finish up the questions here.
That's fine.
So you mentioned that most snowy plovers are in Southern California. How are they successful when they have much more increased human activity? Do they have less corvids?
It's surprising, but the data on how well plovers are doing up and down the Pacific coast as a listed species, there's sort of an absence of data to answer the question about, whether they are doing better or worse in Southern California where there are more people. I can't really address the question because we don't know the average reproductive success of males down there, like we know the average reproductive success of males in Humboldt County or in Oregon, right? So it is true that there are there are more plovers breeding down there and wintering, but how they do is unknown in breeding. And there are some places that are intensively managed. I keep mentioning Camp Pendleton, right? And that the Marine base has restricted access. And so some of the things that go on here can be managed there. I mean, they shoot, they kill, trap ravens and raptors of different species there. They have in the past. translocated peregrine falcons, not out of the state, and then they come right back. Like within a day, the peregrines come back. But anyway, on the marine base they're much more able to do things that if you were to propose those sorts of things in Humboldt County, killing raven, well, we tried that a few years back. There was a very contentious meeting at the Azalea Hall in McKinleyville that I won't talk anymore about, but oh my gosh.
I was at that meeting, I remember.
I did not go to that meeting because I did not want to be the lightning rod. Oh my. But my students reported to me, oh no, you didn't want to be there. I mean, people were just, it was a very, I'm rambling here. It was a very interesting meeting addressing the use of a poison to kill ravens on Clam Beach. And not a poison like strychnine or arsenic or something like that, that could make its way into the food web and persist and secondarily kill other things, or pose a danger to people. But it generated a lot of controversy in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Just, nope, we're not doing this.
Yeah, it was, the reaction to just the proposal of potentially killing ravens had a very strong reaction in Humboldt County, and chemical use of any kind, as we've experienced with Friends of the Dunes. There are some management strategies that use herbicides, and people are very anti any sort of.
Humboldt County is a funny little enclave in that regard.
Yep. Okay, we're going to end on a really easy question, actually. Hopefully easy. I think I know.
What's my favorite bird?
No. That one's hard. I think that one's a difficult one. How long does it take a plover chick to be able to fly?
Good question. So they leave the nest within an hour or so of hatching. And it's about another month. 28 days is what the biologists would say is the average time before the little nubby wings get to the full extent with grown primaries, secondaries, the flight feathers, so that there's some version of sustained flight for, tens of meters. They get better and better at it, but I would say, it's about a month after hatch. And when they're just 1 to 10 days old, they're little balls of fluff. And if you encounter them on the beach, they're not going to run from you as much. They're just going to smash themselves prone onto the substrate and try and hide. Right? They just freeze. And when I saw the ravens eat the chicks that were newly hatched, the raven just methodically searched. Oh, poink, got one. Because they just sat there, right? Yeah. But at about 10 days of age, those little legs are sufficient that they can run and outdistance any human trying to catch them, for instance. I haven't tried, but I guarantee you. So from 10 to 30 days, they get increasingly mobile in running, but by 30 days, boy, they can outfly people and sustain flight of maybe 100 meters. They clearly are getting better and better at it.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Well, that does conclude all of our questions here. I had a really quick one, hopefully, to end here, just for outreach reasons. We're kicking off our Share the Beach program pretty soon, and I know the scientists always refer to this plover as orange red, yellow red.
Yes.
I'm curious what other nicknames he might have.
The old man. The old man. And
No,
I think Natalia or Angela, who are former students in the program who took my shorebirds class, Mark waxes poetic on things or just rambles. And so he's the old man. There is another plover who has a similar name, but because he was involved in an incestuous inbred relationship with his daughter, he's the dirty old man. Ooh. And he lived 12 years. And he's on the reproductive success scale. He's the one that's way out there. He lived on the gravel bars for a long time, but in 1 year, the year in which the population hit 19, there were 10 males and 9 females. The only female that came back to the gravel bar was his daughter. And she knew who he was because he raised her. They paired. She laid a clutch of eggs. They reared 3 chicks successfully.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, too much information on.
We'll end it on that note of the dirty old man.
Oh no.
Maybe
Just
we
stay
need a
with the
second.
old man. Just remember orange, red, yellow, red.
Orange, red, yellow, red. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. We greatly appreciate your time and your expertise. It sounded like there's a lot more plover research to be done. So I don't know if
Yes,
you
there
can
is.
retire yet, but but yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And for
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, it was nice seeing you again, Mark.
Good to see you too, Daisy.
And for those of you still hanging in there, we hope to see you next week as well with our ethnobotany presentation, I believe is next week. All right, and we'll be sending out
Jason.
an email link soon. All right, thank you, everybody. Have a good
Bye-bye.
night.